Welcome to the Napa Legal podcast. I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at Napa Legal.
I'm Alexa Hassel, Summer Legal Fellow at Napa Legal.
And I'm Michael Brito, also a Summer Legal Fellow at Napa Legal.
You're listening to the Napa Legal Weekly podcast, where we explore religious liberty from the perspective of faith-based nonprofits. This week, I'm joined by two of my Summer Legal Fellows, both of whom have done amazing work here at Napa Legal this summer, and who I can now, after about 8 weeks, judge fully competent to speak on this podcast with me. So, Alexa and Michael, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.
So this week we'll be covering, it's a nice change actually in a way. Now that Supreme Court decision release season is over, we're getting back into the flow of finding a lot of the things that maybe fly under the news headline radar, legislative or lawsuit issues happening usually at the state level. A lot of the time we end up catching things on here that end up being tomorrow's Supreme Court issues. So it's nice to kind of go back to our roots and dig up some of the things you're probably not hearing about on your social media feeds and at your news sources. So this week, we're going to cover an ongoing legal battle between a Christian summer camp and the state of Colorado, which we've covered previously on this podcast before. Then we're going to talk about a denial by the state of Virginia of tuition assistance to university students who've chosen religious majors. And finally, we're going to discuss an agreement by a Kentucky school district to stop deleting pro-school choice posts and comments from its social media page. I'm not making that up. That'll be a fun one to conclude with. So let's jump into it. I'm going to start by talking about this Christian camp. I'm not going to try to say the name of the camp because I've looked it up before and I've not figured out if this is like a really long acronym or if it's supposed to be said. It's a Christian summer camp in Colorado. It's IdRaHaJe. If anybody listening knows how to pronounce that properly, please reach out and let me know. So anyway, the camp has served thousands of young campers. It's not a new project. It's been in Colorado for, I think, almost 80 years at this point. So the summer camp is not denominational, but it has a general Christian identity, and it requires, among some other modest things from its Christian identity and faith, that boys and girls use separate sleeping arrangements and have separate bathrooms. And now I would just point out that I don't think you need a Christian identity to have that. I mean, that's been enshrined in secular law for quite a long time. We'll get to that in a minute. But the controversy started when a Colorado state agency started to up its licensing eligibility requirements, which Mary Margaret Bush and I discussed when this camp issue first came up a couple months ago, that it was kind of laughable that there was this in-depth licensing eligibility requirement regime for summer camps in the first place. I thought that you just like, do the basic child safety certifications and then just have a summer camp. I didn't realize how intense of a licensing requirement process you could have to have a summer camp in the first place. But in this case, they amended the Colorado licensing eligibility requirements to force all camps to allow campers to use private spaces, including showers and dressing rooms, according to the gender they identify as. So this was, of course, a problem for the Christian camp. And there was initially a request by the camp for a religious exemption from this law. It was denied by the Colorado State Agency, and then there was a lawsuit. So that's how we left it last time. The lawsuit has recently been settled. And so I just wanted to point out a couple of the updates of how this ended and what it means. First of all, like I said, I'd point out that separate sex spaces like showers and dressing rooms, it's often explicitly stated in statutes that having separate dressing rooms, having separate bathrooms and so on, according to biological sex, is not a violation of non-discrimination laws. And that's true even in a lot of states that have very like aggressive LGBT kind of non-discrimination laws. So I think there's some understanding of the single sex privacy spaces, even in states that are generally hostile to this kind of thinking. And I remember looking up last time, I didn't go and find the citation, but even Colorado has some of this stuff where there is some allowance in Colorado's own non-discrimination laws for biological sex segregated spaces. So kind of interesting that Colorado just draws the line at summer camps, that dressing rooms, showers, they were not going to allow this for a Christian summer camp. So that's how it That's how it went down earlier this year. There was recently a settlement to the lawsuit, and so the settlement agreement clarifies that a Christian nonprofit that exists solely for religious, charitable, and educational purposes, which this camp does, is not subject to the anti-discrimination statute that would have forced it to either close or abandon its religious identity. So interesting about face, and Colorado has now interpreted its religious exemption, which applies to, quote, churches, synagogues, mosques, or any other place that is principally used for religious purposes. Those don't qualify as places of public accommodation, and so they're not subject to the disputed licensing requirements. So it's obviously a good result for the camp, and it ends up setting not a precedent, but it does kind of clarify things, at least for now, in Colorado. And that's kind of what I wanted to use this as a springboard to talk about. Because we see this, first of all, in state religious exemptions from various statutes, non-discrimination laws, and things like that. We often have a real problem of ambiguity about what we're talking about when we're talking about a religious corporation, a religious organization, a religious purpose of a building. It's not always clear. And that can be a real problem. Alexa and I were actually talking about this in another context earlier today. When you have an exemption that refers to religious corporations, what is a religious corporation? The non-lawyer would be reasonable and think, oh, it's a corporation that's religious in its character, period. Maybe. Usually it's not that simple. Sometimes if you look in the definition section of a statute, religious corporation is very limited to a certain type of church. Sometimes it's very broad, and it means any nonprofit that's organized for religious purposes under the IRC, 501c3. And a lot of the time it's not defined at all. So you have to make your best guess or see if the courts have ever weighed in on it. And anyway, it's a real problem. And it requires sometimes a lot of legal research and sometimes just your best interpretation and a prayer. And I don't mean to be flippant about the law, but it's a really big problem when things are not clear. So I think my issue with this Colorado statutory exemption is, and I don't want to get too nerdy with like statutory interpretation here, but I don't like the way it's worded, right? When it's exempting churches, synagogues, mosques, or any other place that's principally used for religious purposes, that doesn't make me think any place used by a religious organization for a food kitchen, a soup kitchen, or a food bank, or a summer camp. It makes me think house of worship, because there's a statutory canon, right, of how you interpret a statute that generally, when you have this and other purposes or and other like items, usually those other items or those other purposes are like what's in the first part of the sentence, right? So I don't want to go too into the way I see Alexa nodding, because this is just the kind of thing that you'd be interested in too, right? But so, right, when you think like, okay, church, synagogue, mosque, we're talking about places of worship. So then when you say any other place principally used for religious purposes, I'm thinking, yeah, maybe house churches, right? Maybe like other places of worship, Buddhist temples, things like that. But I'm not thinking that it's very broad. So unfortunately, these statutes require some interpretation. Now, the good thing that happened in this Colorado case is the Colorado agency not only privately settled the case, because that settlement only affects how it's going to treat this camp, not all future summer camps or religious organizations, but there's a bit of a future clarification, at least for now, that the department, after the settlement, actually posted a memo on its website saying that that such religious organizations like these summer camps don't qualify as places of a public accommodation, and they're not subject to these licensing requirements. So there's always kind of this hierarchy of precedent, hierarchy of clarity of what's helpful for religious organizations, right? Obviously, what's helpful, ideally, is a statute that instead of saying churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places used for religious purposes would just say any organization that is a nonprofit and is organized for religious purposes is exempt from this law, because then it's crystal clear who it's talking about. If you don't have that, then at least binding court precedent, right? If an appellate court decides, no, we interpret for religious purposes broadly, it includes all Christian camps, all Christian nonprofit organizations that run schools or after school programs, court precedent can change, but it is binding on more than the parties at play. But this is a trial court settlement. It's a private party settlement. So there's no binding court precedent, but the fact that the department has posted it's not a legal change, but it does give you a sense of what this department, at least right now under the current leadership in Colorado, is intending to do, which is to not enforce these licensing requirements on Christian camps, religious camps, right? So we actually encountered this exact same issue last week in a different context when we talked about that National Religious Broadcasters case, right? That when the IRS says, well, we have this agreement with the other party and we interpret, 501c3 to allow this, it didn't bind anybody, but it does signal that this is what the IRS is going to do, right? So it's not useless, but it's a lot more subject to change than clear statutes or binding court precedents. So I won't go on further, but I think this was a good opportunity to talk about this being a win, but like a lot of things, it's a win that's a little bit nuanced. So Camp IdRaHaJe is free to segregate boys from girls in the sleeping arrangements and bathrooms, and it can operate, which I don't mean to be flippant about. It's a huge win. I mean, this is a Christian camp that's been serving thousands of kids, and it seems like a really solid program from the little I've read. And so to deny that because they won't let boys go into the girls' like dorm or changing room, it's really such an offense, and a harm to the people of the state of Colorado who are, would otherwise be denied a good service from a good religious institution over ideology that's really not relevant to what this camp does at all. So I think at that we will move from Christian camps in Colorado to religious students in the state of Virginia. So Michael, take it away.
Well, thank you, Frank, for that great overview about what's happening in Colorado. So we're just going to move over to the East Coast to an unfortunate situation that's happening with some students at Liberty University. So there's a program in Virginia called the Virginia Tuition Assistance Grant Program, and we're just going to call it VTAG for short. And what they do is that if you're a student in Virginia and you're enrolled in a private nonprofit university, you could receive some tuition assistance essentially. But what's happening in this situation is that several students at Liberty University, and Liberty University is a very well-known Protestant Christian university in America, they are studying in degrees that have an exclusive religious content. So one student, for example, he's studying, his major is pastoral leadership. Another student is going to get his degree or trying to get his degree in music and worship. And then the final student is looking to get his degree in something similar to the pastoral leadership program. But VTAG denied the grant because they deemed it to be too religious. But what's interesting about this case is that they have offered it before to different schools, so they're being very selective. Such as the Virginia Wesleyan University Religious Studies degree. They've given out assistance to those programs that they've decreed to be eligible. So the students filed a lawsuit against the state officials for illegal religious discrimination, and they've been citing some recent precedent that's been said about this issue from Carson, Trinity Lutheran, Espinoza, and those cases have the holding that shows that the religious individual or entity cannot legally be denied a generally available public benefit like financial assistance. Essentially from one good line from Carson that kind of summarizes this whole issue, and where the problem is that the government violates the free exercise clause when it excludes the religious observers from any public benefit. So part of the big problem is that what VTAG is doing is that they are discriminating because the degree is religious in itself. So the base of discrimination is religious in itself. And it just creates this arbitrary and really irrational distinction based off what the people at VTAG really decide to be too religious. And just because that basis of discrimination is the religious content of it. it's really a violation of the First Amendment. And just to go back to what we were talking about, what we've been talking about through the past couple of weeks, is that it relates to some of the cases that the court has heard this past term. At Catholic Charities, for example, that was a big victory for religious liberty, and especially around the Establishment Clause. And there in the Catholic Charities, the court affirmed that when there's disparate treatment based off of the religious or the religion or discriminations of a religious nature, then there's a violation of the Establishment Clause. In that case, it was almost seeing as a state entanglement as, just trying with almost like denominational favoritism or just entangling with the affairs of religion. And we even saw something similar in the Mahmoud case, where there were laws that placed an undue burden on the individual's ability to just practice their faith. So now students, like these three students, for example, they're put in an unfortunate situation where they're either going to have to choose to study theology or not get tuition. And, for anyone who really wants to study that program, they know it's often hard to have the opportunity to do so. And, Liberty University is one of the many universities across the country that allow students to engage in a vibrant vibrant Christian community. So hopefully we can there could be a good result from it. Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that the crux of this case kind of hinges on the proper understanding of religious liberty and the First Amendment protections. The free exercise clause wasn't meant to just be relegated to private worship, but it was supposed to allow individuals to go out into the public sphere, as public square, and to really engage with their faith in a protected way, in a much more tolerant way. And on the other hand, the Establishment Clause, it wasn't for a secular society, secular state, and to remove religion, but it was just to respect each sphere and not have this overlap and unnecessary intertwinement between the church and the state. But obviously, we've seen, especially we saw in the 50s, just this kind of flip of the religious freedom jurisprudence. But recent cases like Catholic Charities, Mahmoud, Trinity Lutheran, Our Lady of Guadalupe, those cases are kind of bringing the court's jurisprudence on religious liberty back to its traditional and original understanding. So we can see, or we can hope that if this case is when this case is brought up, if it makes its way to the Supreme Court, then it's very unlikely that it will pass strict scrutiny, the highest level of judicial analysis, because of this really discrimination based off their religion. But I think we're seeing a lot of positive trends for religious liberty in the country, and yeah, we can only pray and hope that a good outcome comes, and hopefully it can provide the protections for students who need the financial assistance and want to pursue their religious studies. But that's all it for this story. So
I just wanted to say a couple things on this, if you don't mind, because
yeah, no,
there are some fascinating fact patterns going on here that kind of intertwine with a lot of the cases that we care about, and you pointed to most of it. But I think a couple things. For one, I wonder how this will resolve practically, because I think there's a big distinction here where if VTAG backs off on like the student who's planning on the music and worship one, because that's clearly like it has a religious component for like worship music, but that's a lay person's degree, right? It's a music degree with a religious flair. But if you just limited it to no, we're going to deny like the pastoral training because that's akin to like paying for seminary formation rather than a normal undergrad, I think it would actually make it a more interesting case. Or at least a little bit of a harder one. Like the government would have a little bit more ground to stand on to say, no, we'll pay for any kind of undergraduate education, but seminary and like minister training is a separate thing. And that's not what these grants are for. I'm not saying that's right, but I think that would be a better case. And I would also say, yeah, particularly the two cases that are really on point and really interesting here are how Virginia can face Carson v. Macon, especially, which is, I mean, the Supreme Court's been crystal clear for several years now that, yeah, if you have a generally available public benefit, you cannot discriminate against religious programs purely because they're religious programs. So I don't know how you get around that in a case like this. And then lastly, to your point, Michael, the kind of question of, are they just saying no religious programs? It doesn't seem like it. The complaints seem to say that they've granted, right, for other students going to other schools studying religious studies or things like that. So if they're discriminating between, like, well, you can be religious but not too religious, or you can be religious but you can't be Liberty University, then you're falling squarely into what the court has just said in Wisconsin Catholic Charities, like you mentioned. And I do wonder, in the like political media background, if this is not so much about how religious the program is as much as this is Liberty University. I mean, they've been in the crosshairs of hostile governments for a lot of years. I mean, they're just involved in that oh, what's the case called? Zinsky, right? They fired that employee who identified as transgender, and there was a federal lawsuit that was in the news a few months ago. So Liberty is very outspoken as like a culture war, right? Christian university hotspot. And so, one wonders if these weren't targeted denials of these grants. Don't know, but it wouldn't be shocking.
Right. No, I agree. And just the fact that um it reminds me a lot in with the with the Washington state law that purposely was targeted clergy, and here the discrimination is just based off the fact that it's religious. So it's one of those instances when you look at the facts of what's happening, and because discrimination is based on the fact that this is a religious program and they're doing something very religious, that I don't see how it could pass strict scrutiny. But again, I really hope it's a good win for these students who want to study, what they want to do. I don't think yeah.
Well, I know we're going to flip to Alexa for the last one, but just to know, because you mentioned the Washington law, we're recording on Friday, July 18th, and as of like an hour ago, the district court in Washington did just block that law. I mean, don't really need to cover it. It's blatantly unconstitutional, but we were all waiting for that, but it has been blocked as of today. So I guess we can now head to our last case, which is what state are we in now, Alexa?
We're moving back into Kentucky.
Okay, here we are.
So we have a different kind of actor and a different First Amendment issue here, but it's actually quite akin to what we've just been talking about in the podcast so far. So in Kentucky, there's Pulaski. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but we're going to go with that pronunciation. Pulaski County School District. They had been using their Facebook account to post different posts and videos and things advocating against a state constitutional amendment that would have expanded school choice in Kentucky. Now, that amendment actually failed. It was up for vote in November of 2024 and it didn't pass. So that issue itself in Kentucky is kind of moot. But what happened here is that after this school district had been posting these things, Corey DeAngelis, who's a pro school choice advocate, had been replying, making comments, leaving things like this. Nothing that was expressly harsh or inappropriate or anything like that, but just basically disagreeing with the school district online. And the school district had been removing his comments to their posts and then later blocked him from their account. So he sued the school district and the Board of Education and their superintendent for violation of his First Amendment right to free speech. Why? Because they were censoring and restricting his online speech. So simply because he was disagreeing with their criticisms of what was called in Kentucky Amendment 2, this pro school choice amendment. Now, what changed in the lawsuit was that recently a consent decree ended it. So, what is a consent decree? Well, one party submitted a motion for entry of consent, which is typically filed to enforce a settlement agreement. So the parties have agreed to some terms, and now they're formalizing them through the court and basically publishing them as final. And as a result of this publication of the settlement, this order, the district court the district, quote, committed to not otherwise engage in viewpoint-based restrictions on social media. Now, viewpoint-based restrictions is a legal term that relates, of course, to the First Amendment free speech clause. And what that means essentially is that the district has said, we recognize, and hopefully they do actually recognize, that it is impermissible and they are not allowed to restrict content on their social media feeds simply because they disagree with the view that is taken by the other person. So this isn't actually overly broad. It's pretty cut and dry that it's simply on the disagreement of content, right? Here, you have one on one side, one on the other side, and they're saying you can't block this person simply because they happen to fall on the other side. Now, it means that the ban is not complete. So the school district would still have the authority to possibly report members of a social media or remove comments, even temporarily, if those comments or individuals were violating other rules. So if they were violating policies of the social media platform, or maybe just general policies of the school district, if they were using obscene language or something like this, there would be a basis there likely to remove some of those comments or block engagement with users, but there is not that same basis when it's a disagreement simply on a viewpoint here, which is what was at issue in this case. So now what we say is the district could do a couple of different things, two in particular. They could just simply presumptively or preemptively disable all comments on their social media. So if they really don't want to see comments that they disagree with, it would be permissible for them to just go in and close comments entirely, whether for particular posts or just in general, because then you're not removing ones you specifically disagree with. You're just not creating the space in the first place, which technically they're allowed to do. If comments remain active, then they cannot select them simply for preference. That would be a violation. The other thing they could do is what I already mentioned. It's just report any user that they think has violated other policies. Now, you can't do that sort of half-heartedly. Like you can't do it as a guise for disagreeing with their viewpoint, but you could do it if you thought that there was a legitimate issue with a violation of a policy there. So this was a really interesting case of somewhat similar to, I think, instances of the Washington case where it seemed pretty clear that it was not permissible for the school district to do this online, but just reaffirms that government officials, because this, we have to remember, were state actors, it's a public school district at issue here, cannot censor private actors when they're engaging in online speech.
Yeah, it's hard to know what's going on here. I mean, my guess is that, right, if you're working in like a congressional office, right, or a federal agency, and you're controlling the communications, you have a certain level of savvy. Like anybody who's in there is quite aware that they're a government actor and that they have to be very careful that they're not violating constitutional rights because they are the government. But I think when you get down to like the local county school district, the person who happens to be like running the Facebook page is probably doesn't have the same awareness to you. You're just like, yeah, I run the Facebook page. No, I don't want those on there. And it's like you forget that you're actually a state actor. That's my guess, because otherwise it's just not defensible. Right? When it got called out, the school district acknowledged, yes, state actors can't do this. So my best guess is this is just an employee running this page and didn't really realize that, oh yeah, the First Amendment applies to us. Yeah.
It's a good reminder that all employee documents and training should always be updated when you're a state actor to remind people in your annual training that even though you think you're just, a small employee in a small office in a county or school or local government, you're still required to abide by certain things like First Amendment.
Yeah, great point. All right. Well, we have crossed the country and hit a few big things this week. And with that, I think I'll wrap up. So, Michael and Alexa, thanks so much for joining us this week. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this episode. If you enjoyed the content we're putting out, as always, we appreciate it if you'd like the podcast, subscribe on our channel on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you happen to be listening from. So we hope you'll join us next week as we continue to highlight some of the most important ongoing legal issues that affect religious liberty and the work of faith-based nonprofit organizations. We'll talk to you all next week. Thank you for joining us. God bless you.